Forced to marry a divorced 40-year-old millionaire when she was just 18, she never expected to. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. The night Seraphina Vane finally understood why Elias Thorne was called the iceberg of Wall Street. She knew it wasn't just coldness, but the absolute absence of temperature. A black hole capable of sucking the warmth out of the entire room. She stood amidst the golden glittering ballroom, where powerful men used their eyes like scalpels to dissect her solely because she was the daughter of a once venerable family, now teetering on the edge of ruin. Her rented white silk dress felt heavy, and the rigid smile she held was a mask barely concealing her turmoil. A crippling family debt, a hanging sentence of bankruptcy had driven her to this place, the annual Thorne Corp charity gala. She hadn't come to beg, she had come to endure a humiliating arrangement. Then he materialized. Elias Thorne, impossibly tall in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his steel-gray eyes devoid of any discernible emotion. He walked straight toward her, ignoring the murmurs of the elite crowd, and when he stopped, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Miss Vane, his voice was deep and chilling like melting ice. I have a proposition. The surrounding cacophony faded as Elias smoothly maneuvered Seraphina away from the spotlight and into a private study adjacent to the ballroom, a room steeped in the scent of rich leather and cold power. There, he wasted no time on pleasantries or small talk. He simply placed a pre-drafted contract onto the expansive mahogany desk. It was an arrangement for a 5-year contractual marriage. Seraphina's world had been crumbling for months since her father's failed investment left them owing staggering sums threatening to seize their ancestral home. She needed $10 million in the next 48 hours, an impossible sum. Elias, according to the contract's dry legal jargon, required a wife one with an untarnished pedigree to stabilize his public image and placate difficult shareholders ahead of a monumental multi-billion-dollar tech merger. For Elias, this was a straightforward business transaction, a clean, emotionless exchange of assets. His conditions were brutal. Seraphina would receive the exact amount required to save her family and a modest trust fund. In return, she must live under his roof, adhere strictly to all social schedules, and never under any circumstances interfere with his private life or business affairs. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. Understand this, Seraphina. This is a commercial exchange. There will be no love, no jealousy, and no demands beyond the public performance. You are my business partner, nothing more. Seraphina felt a wave of icy humiliation wash over her. She tried to cling to the last shred of her dignity. What are the terms of divorce, Miss Thorne? Elias allowed himself a brief, chilling smirk. He pointed to the penalty clause. Should Seraphina break the contract early, she would not only have to repay the initial sum, but also incur a triple penalty guaranteeing her family's utter devastation. It was a perfect trap designed to ensure absolute compliance. She had no choice. With a trembling hand, Seraphina signed her name beneath his, the signature sealing her fate as his contracted wife. The ink was barely dry when Elias took her hand and pulled her back into the dazzling chaos of the ballroom. He announced their engagement, the sudden news sending shockwaves through the New York elite. As photographers surged forward, desperate for a shot, Elias executed an act that was entirely unexpected. He pulled Seraphina close, his hand clamping possessively around her waist, and delivered their first public kiss. It was utterly devoid of passion, a cold, calculated gesture of ownership, a declaration of power before the world. Seraphina's mind reeled, but she held the pose, her face fixed in the expression of a blissfully happy bride-to-be. As he finally released her, Elias looked at her with utterly vacant eyes, making her feel profoundly exposed and objectified. Yet the contract was signed and her family was safe. The journey back to the Thorne estate in the Upper East Side was silent, the tension in the black Maybach thick enough to cut. Seraphina anticipated being shown to a modest separate wing, but Elias stopped her outside a set of towering dark oak double doors. "Where are you going, Seraphina?" His voice was low, cutting through the silence. To make this performance convincing, especially to the staff and security, we must leave no room for doubt. No one can suspect a separating couple. He pushed open the massive doors, revealing the master bedroom, a space vast and cold as a museum, dominated by a king-size bed shrouded in gray silk. From now on, you sleep here, in this room, on that bed. There will be no physical contact, just geographical proximity. If you disrupt my concentration or violate any rule regarding my personal space, you will find yourself in the hallway immediately. Welcome home, contract wife. Seraphina stood on the threshold of the enormous dark room, the coldness of this forced marriage feeling far more daunting than she had imagined. She was Mrs. Elias Thorne, but she was merely a ghost assigned to a corner of his life. The king-size bed in Elias Thorne's master suite felt less like a place of rest and more like a vast icy plain. Seraphina lay stiffly near the edge, facing away from the empty half. Elias had not returned until 4 a.m., moving with the stealth of a predator, yet the chilling presence he radiated was enough to keep her awake until dawn. She had managed to allocate a small, forgotten corner of the massive walk-in closet for her few belongings, feeling utterly misplaced in a room that screamed power, sterility, and loneliness. When the morning light filtered weakly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Elias was already up. He showered and dressed in absolute silence, his movements precise and economical. There was a hostility in his routine, a deliberate distancing that seemed to warn her against any intrusion. Before leaving for Thorne Corp, he didn't offer breakfast or a word of farewell. Instead, he handed her a crisp, laminated sheet of paper, the Thorne rules. The list was extensive and meticulous. Do not enter the home office without explicit permission. Breakfast is at 7:00 a.m. only if he is present, and she must be silent. Absolutely nothing in the mansion is to be rearranged or replaced, down to the smallest decorative item. The final bolded rule reiterated the most important one. There shall be no physical contact outside of public engagements under any circumstances. He left without waiting for confirmation. Seraphina, an artist who thrived on warmth and color, felt suffocated by the mansion's palette of white, gray, and black. This was her silent rebellion. Defying the rule against change, she slipped out to a small exclusive florist. She returned with a vibrant purple Phalaenopsis orchid, a living testament to defiance, and placed it on the small, designated writing desk he had assigned her. It was a tiny, bold statement that she was not a ghost. Later that afternoon, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the man she was bound to, Seraphina explored the vast drawing room. Everything was perfectly symmetrical, museum quality. Tucked away on a shadowed console, she found it a small, dark mahogany music box. It was elegantly carved but looked unused. She hesitated, knowing it violated the rules, yet her fingers traced the smooth, cold wood. She lifted the lid. A delicate, hauntingly sweet melody, utterly foreign to the mansion's silence, drifted into the air. Seraphina felt a momentary welcome sense of peace. But just then the front door opened. Elias was home hours early, looking stressed and distracted. He heard the music. Elias froze. His eyes, usually steel, were filled with a sudden, disproportionate panic. He didn't speak. He lunged. He tore across the room and snatched the box from Seraphina's grasp, but his movement was too violent, too uncontrolled. The box slipped, struck the marble floor, and the lid was chipped. The delicate chime silenced abruptly in a jarring metallic thwack. Elias stared at the damage, and then he looked at Seraphina. His eyes held not just rage, but a flash of raw, searing pain, which quickly solidified into an ice-cold fury, far worse than his usual detachment. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low and vibrating with menace. "I warned you not to touch anything that wasn't yours." Seraphina backed away, genuinely shaken. She realized his reaction was not about monetary value. It was about something deeply, catastrophically personal. She murmured an apology, but Elias didn't listen. He simply summoned the head housekeeper and ordered the music box to be sealed, wrapped, and locked away, as if its very existence was a painful transgression. That night, Seraphina couldn't shake the image of his momentary vulnerability. She needed to know more. After midnight, when she was sure Elias was immersed in his work, she slipped out and walked silently toward his closed office door. It was slightly ajar. She peered through the gap. Elias was sitting at his imposing desk, not working on a computer screen, but gazing blankly into the room. He seemed utterly lost, shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen. Her eyes were drawn to the stone wall directly behind him. There was a faint hairline crack in the white marble, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. It seemed out of place in the perfection of the house. As she watched, Elias slowly lifted his hand. His index finger, usually busy tapping codes or signing documents, softly traced the line of the crack. In that brief, unguarded moment, when his face was profiled to the sliver of light, Seraphina saw it. The suppression in his eyes broke. They were watery, almost glistening with what looked like a forming tear. He blinked quickly, violently, and the emotion vanished, replaced by the familiar cold mask. Seraphina immediately retreated, heart pounding. She returned to the master suite, shivering despite the warmth of the room. She realized the terrible truth: Elias Thorne was not emotionless. He was merely encased in a self-made prison of ice, and she had just witnessed the slightest, most dangerous fissure. Her curiosity had deepened into a cautious, dangerous empathy. Seraphina was subjected to Elias Thorne's full performance regimen. She was fitted for an exquisite gown, a deep emerald silk that complemented her eyes and adorned with borrowed jewels that felt like ice against her skin. Elias personally oversaw the preparation, his instructions precise and emotionless. Smile. Touch my arm lightly during introductions. Maintain an air of admiring devotion. And above all, do not speak unless spoken to, and never discuss business. She felt less like a fiancé and more like a high-stakes, meticulously programmed android. Their destination was a private dining room at the Savoy reserved for a crucial dinner with Thorne Corp's largest shareholders and potential merger partners, including the powerful chairman Henderson. As they entered, the buzz in the room ceased, all eyes hungry, judgmental and curious, falling on the perfectly assembled couple. Seraphina executed her role flawlessly. She offered the dazzling practiced smile. Her answers to social inquiries were witty but brief, and she maintained a calculated proximity to Elias, ensuring the required public intimacy. Elias played the doting fiancé with masterful deception. He would occasionally lean in, his breath cold against her ear, whispering not sweet nothings but reminders of the contract's terms, while his hand rested possessively on the small of her back. The physical touch, though public, felt controlled and entirely devoid of warmth. The dinner proceeded smoothly until Chairman Henderson began the main presentation on the impending technology merger. A large screen projected detailed financial data and market growth projections. Most attendees nodded approvingly, swept up in the narrative of guaranteed billion-dollar returns. However, as the slide detailing projected market acceleration flashed up, Seraphina's artist's intuition immediately flared. Her eyes, trained over years to detect subtle nuances in color, texture, and light, noticed an anomaly in the graphic. The line representing future growth showed a sharp, almost impossible vertical spike. The color resolution within that specific spike was slightly different, too sharp, too saturated compared to the rest of the historical data line. It looked to her trained eye exactly like a layer of digitally manipulated pigment on a canvas. Seraphina realized a critical piece of data had been fraudulently edited to inflate the expected profitability. Against Elias's explicit rule of silence, Seraphina could not hold back. The potential danger was too immense. She spoke up, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, slicing through the technical jargon in the room. Mr. Henderson, the growth projections are indeed impressive. She began, drawing everyone's attention. But I am curious why the color fidelity of the acceleration spike appears inconsistent with the historical data's resolution. It presents as a layer that has been digitally overpainted. The table fell silent. Henderson's face tightened. Elias's head snapped towards Seraphina. His gaze lethal, not because she was wrong, but because she had dared to violate his strictures. Elias, however, was too astute to ignore the potential severity of her observation. Without acknowledging Seraphina directly, he spoke into his lapel microphone, summoning his chief engineer, who was discreetly waiting outside. He demanded an immediate forensic check of the graphics source file. The findings were devastating. The graphical data point had been deliberately manipulated to conceal a market flaw, a deception that would have cost Thorne Corp $500 million had the deal closed. Henderson was speechless, his scheme exposed by Elias Thorne's seemingly decorative fiancée. Elias had been saved by her acute observation. As the dinner broke up in chaos, Elias dismissed his engineer, then turned to Seraphina, his hand gripping her arm. "You just saved me $500 million, he murmured, his voice low and dangerous. "But never break my rules again unless you are 100% certain." Just then, Cassandra Vance, a stunningly beautiful woman, known for her ruthless corporate takeovers, and Elias's former intimate acquaintance, glided toward them. She wore a mocking smile, ignoring Seraphina completely. She reached up and placed a hand intimately on Elias's cheek. "How sweet, Elias. Hasn't your little doll worn out her welcome yet? Shouldn't she go back to her small, quiet life and let the adults discuss things?" Cassandra's words were a deliberate public slight, dismissing Seraphina as a temporary plaything. Seraphina felt the sting of humiliation, but maintained her poise. She waited for Elias to defend her. Elias, however, did something far more potent. He removed Cassandra's hand from his face with deliberate slowness, then tightened his grip on Seraphina's waist, pulling her flush against his side. His eyes fixed on Cassandra were the coldest she had ever seen them. "Cassandra," he stated, his voice resonating with final authority, "my wife-to-be is a valuable partner, not a toy. And unlike you, she doesn't fabricate documentation. I suggest you choose your words carefully. Miss Vane has the Thorne name and she is now under my protection." Elias did not look at Seraphina again. He simply steered her out of the restaurant, the tension between them magnified tenfold. Seraphina was left wondering, was she protected because he valued her or because she was a valuable asset he owned? She realized that despite his coldness, Elias Thorne was fiercely protective of anything he claimed as his, a dangerous complication in their contractual arrangement. The aftermath of the tense dinner in Chapter 3 left Seraphina realizing that Elias Thorne's cold demeanor was not inherent, but a heavily armored shell. His fierce, albeit detached defense of her against Cassandra Vance only amplified her profound curiosity. Now that her initial fear had subsided, an unstoppable drive took hold. She needed to understand the trauma that had manufactured the iceberg of Wall Street. Her focus remained on the only two blemishes in his perfectly controlled environment, the sealed music box and the faint crack on the wall in his private office. Seraphina began spending hours in the Thornes' colossal private library, a sanctuary of ancient texts and forgotten history. Pretending to research corporate law to appease the staff, she sought obscure records. Tucked away within a shelf of century-old family ledgers, she discovered a slim leather-bound volume detailing the Thorne lineage. The entry under Elias's generation was stark. Elias Thorne, born 1988. Daniel Thorne, born 1991, deceased. The timeline of Daniel's unfortunate accident coincided precisely with the period when the public, Elias Thorne, transformed from a promising young visionary into the ruthlessly effective, emotionally distant tycoon. Later that afternoon, searching through a rarely used storage closet near the library, she found a dusty, unlabeled wooden chest. Inside, beneath layers of moth-eaten velvet, lay a small, tarnished silver frame. It contained a faded photograph of two boys, a younger, slightly awkward Elias, and a bright-eyed, gap-toothed boy, Daniel. In Daniel's hands was the very object that Elias had guarded so violently, the mahogany music box intact and unscratched. The evidence was irrefutable. The music box was Daniel's. Elias's outburst in Chapter 2 hadn't been about a broken object, but the shattering of the last tangible link to his lost brother. A profound surge of empathy washed over Seraphina. She no longer saw the contract tyrant, but a wounded man trapped in a prison of guilt. This discovery spurred her into action. She used her hidden talent, her meticulous artistic skill, to begin a secret project. She quietly acquired specialized woodworking tools and varnish, dedicating hours in the small, unused sunroom, teaching herself how to repair the delicate hinge and meticulously fill the chip in the mahogany of the music box. It was a silent act of devotion, a quiet attempt to heal a wound Elias wouldn't allow her to touch. The stress from the Cassandra Vance incident and the near miss on the merger had clearly taken its toll. Elias returned from the office late one evening, looking pale and utterly depleted, dismissing his staff immediately. The next morning, Seraphina awoke to an unsettling silence. She found Elias in bed, shivering violently under the heavy duvet, his brow slick with sweat. He had tried to self-medicate and ignore the illness, but a high, relentless fever had set in. Acting purely on instinct, Seraphina immediately called his personal physician, overriding his usual protocol of solitary suffering. She dismissed the distant nurse the doctor tried to send and took over the care herself. She held ice packs to his forehead, administered the prescribed medication, and ensured he stayed hydrated. It was an act of raw, unconditional kindness delivered without a single word of complaint or reference to their contract. As night deepened, the fever worsened, dragging Elias into a state of delirium. Seraphina sat beside him, watching the iron control melt away from his face. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He began to murmur, his voice weak and cracked, the opposite of the booming authority she was used to. He called out the name Daniel, his plea thick with agony. "It was my fault, all my fault," he whispered repeatedly, caught in the grip of his recurring nightmare. Seraphina continued to wipe the sweat from his temples. Suddenly, Elias's hand shot out, not in rejection, but in blind, desperate need. His cold fingers wrapped tightly around her own, clutching her like a lifeline in a turbulent sea. She felt the fierce heat radiating from his palm against her cooler skin. It was the first physical contact that was unplanned, unscripted, and entirely sincere, a pure, raw confession of his loneliness and terror. Seraphina did not pull away. She sat quietly, allowing him the touch, recognizing that in his weakness, he had finally revealed the most vulnerable part of his soul. Elias Thorne awoke to the stark memory of his fever-induced weakness, the clammy hand desperately clutching Seraphina's, the muffled confession of guilt over Daniel. He recoiled violently from the vulnerability. When the fever broke, his coldness returned, magnified tenfold by shame and self-loathing. He didn't thank her for her care. He simply retreated behind an impenetrable barrier of work. He stayed in his office for 3 consecutive days, communicating with her only through his executive assistant, effectively making Seraphina invisible again. This distance was a punishment for both of them, but primarily for himself for momentarily allowing a connection. To reset the dynamic and prove that Seraphina was and always would be motivated purely by money, Elias summoned her to his office on the 4th day. The music box sat locked away. The crack in the wall remained untouched. He was impeccably dressed, rigid and remote. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he slid a leather folder across the desk. Inside lay a black unmarked credit card with unlimited spending power, and crucially, a personal check signed by him. The amount field blank. "You've successfully maintained appearances despite the recent stress," he stated, his voice flat. "This is a bonus. Use the card for all necessities. Use the check to settle any lingering family debts or any extravagant wish you might harbor. I require my wife to be free of financial distractions. Consider this liquidity for your continued performance." This was his final cynical test, an attempt to confirm her avarice and allow him to keep his emotional distance intact. Seraphina picked up the check, feeling the weight of the blank space. She understood immediately. He was testing her greed, hoping she would demand 10 times the original contract amount, so he could dismiss the fleeting connection they shared as purely transactional. A deep sense of insult burned within her. She looked up at him, her gaze steady, a contrast to his averted eyes. "Thank you, Elias, but the price of my freedom was negotiated and my family is safe. I will use the card for expenses necessary to fulfill my obligations under the contract." She slid the blank check back across the desk. "I'm not here to sell myself piece by piece, Mr. Thorne. I am only here to honor the agreement." Her refusal to capitalize on his momentary weakness or her own needs surprised him, though he quickly masked it. Seraphina pocketed the black card but used it sparingly. She purchased high-quality art supplies, canvases, rare pigments, and restoration materials necessary for her secret work on the music box. Her real focus, however, was on the other casualty of Elias's past, his younger sister Clara, whom Seraphina had briefly discovered. Knowing Elias was still isolating himself, Seraphina reached out through mutual contacts she had cultivated during public appearances. Using the card, she rented a modest gallery space for an evening and quietly arranged a pop-up exhibition for local emerging artists, including Clara, who had been struggling to showcase her work due to lack of funds and Elias's disapproval. Seraphina attended the event simply as Mrs. Thorne, offering encouraging words and introducing Clara to a few influential patrons she had met through Elias. Her goal was not to boast, but to give Clara the confidence and visibility Elias had unknowingly denied her. Elias, monitoring the unlimited credit card as rigorously as his stock portfolio, noticed the series of small, unusual transactions: no high-end jewelry, no designer clothes, just art supplies, rental fees for a small venue, and catering deposits. Intrigued, he ordered a full surveillance report. The report arrived detailing not only the purchases, but also the entire gallery event. He saw a photograph of Seraphina smiling genuinely standing next to a radiant Clara. The accompanying text confirmed Seraphina had facilitated the show, giving Clara credit and a much-needed break, all without notifying Elias or seeking any personal gain. He stared at the picture of his estranged sister and his contract wife, both laughing. Elias realized with a crushing force that his test had failed. Seraphina was not motivated by the greed he sought to confirm. She was motivated by an empathy and generosity that broke all his cynical assumptions, and in doing so, she had quietly created a bridge to the family he had deliberately pushed away. He was left in bewildered contemplation. He had tried to drive her away with money, but she had used his resources to draw closer to the heart of his pain. Elias Thorne awoke to the stark memory of his fever-induced weakness, the clammy hand desperately clutching Seraphina's, the muffled confession of guilt over Daniel. He recoiled violently from the vulnerability. When the fever broke, his coldness returned magnified tenfold by shame and self-loathing. He didn't thank her for her care. He simply retreated behind an impenetrable barrier of work. He stayed in his office for 3 consecutive days, communicating with her only through his executive assistant, effectively making Seraphina invisible again. This distance was a punishment for both of them, but primarily for himself, for momentarily allowing a connection. To reset the dynamic and prove that Seraphina was and always would be motivated purely by money, Elias summoned her to his office on the 4th day. The music box sat locked away. The crack in the wall remained untouched. He was impeccably dressed, rigid and remote. He didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he slid a leather folder across the desk. Inside lay a black unmarked credit card with unlimited spending power, and crucially a personal check signed by him, the amount field blank. "You've successfully maintained appearances despite the recent stress," he stated, his voice flat. "This is a bonus. Use the card for all necessities. Use the check to settle any lingering family debts or any extravagant wish you might harbor. I require my wife to be free of financial distractions. Consider this liquidity for your continued performance." This was his final cynical test, an attempt to confirm her avarice and allow him to keep his emotional distance intact. Seraphina picked up the check, feeling the weight of the blank space. She understood immediately. He was testing her greed, hoping she would demand 10 times the original contract amount, so he could dismiss the fleeting connection they shared as purely transactional. A deep sense of insult burned within her. She looked up at him, her gaze steady, a contrast to his averted eyes. "Thank you, Elias, but the price of my freedom was negotiated and my family is safe. I will use the card for expenses necessary to fulfill my obligations under the contract." She slid the blank check back across the desk. "I am not here to sell myself piece by piece, Mr. Thorne. I am only here to honor the agreement." Her refusal to capitalize on his momentary weakness or her own needs surprised him, though he quickly masked it. Seraphina pocketed the black card but used it sparingly. She purchased high-quality art supplies, canvases, rare pigments, and restoration materials necessary for her secret work on the music box. Her real focus, however, was on the other casualty of Elias's past, his younger sister Clara, whom Seraphina had briefly discovered. Knowing Elias was still isolating himself, Seraphina reached out through mutual contacts she had cultivated during public appearances. Using the card, she rented a modest gallery space for an evening and quietly arranged a pop-up exhibition for local emerging artists, including Clara, who had been struggling to showcase her work due to lack of funds and Elias's disapproval. Seraphina attended the event simply as Mrs. Thorne, offering encouraging words and introducing Clara to a few influential patrons she had met through Elias. Her goal was not to boast, but to give Clara the confidence and visibility Elias had unknowingly denied her. Elias, monitoring the unlimited credit card as rigorously as his stock portfolio, noticed a series of small, unusual transactions: no high-end jewelry, no designer clothes, just art supplies, rental fees for a small venue, and catering deposits. Intrigued, he ordered a full surveillance report. The report arrived detailing not only the purchases, but also the entire gallery event. He saw a photograph of Seraphina smiling genuinely, standing next to a radiant Clara. The accompanying text confirmed Seraphina had facilitated the show, giving Clara credit and a much-needed break, all without notifying Elias or seeking any personal gain. He stared at the picture of his estranged sister and his contract wife, both laughing. Elias realized with a crushing force that his test had failed. Seraphina was not motivated by the greed he sought to confirm. She was motivated by an empathy and generosity that broke all his cynical assumptions, and in doing so she had quietly created a bridge to the family he had deliberately pushed away. He was left in bewildered contemplation. He had tried to drive her away with money, but she had used his resources to draw closer to the heart of his pain. The surprising success of Clara's art exhibition, orchestrated in secret by Seraphina, did nothing to close the emotional distance Elias maintained. If anything, her unexpected competence and kindness amplified his fear of attachment. To maintain his image and manage a high-stakes corporate acquisition, Elias had to fly to Seattle. He brought Seraphina, his essential human shield, along. Aboard the private jet, the silence was palpable. Seraphina worked on the delicate restoration of the music box, a silent testament to her true agenda, while Elias reviewed complex legal documents, their proximity purely professional. Upon arrival in Seattle, fate intervened. A massive, unprecedented winter storm swept in, paralyzing air travel and cutting off most communication lines, trapping them instantly. They were isolated in Elias's sprawling, technologically advanced penthouse apartment. The staff and personal assistants were unable to reach them, leaving only Elias, Seraphina, and the chilling silence of the apartment. It was a pressure cooker environment designed to break down the highly controlled boundaries Elias relied upon. With the city blanketed in snow and resources limited, Seraphina took charge of the basic necessities. Using what little was stored in the ultra-modern kitchen, she prepared a simple, comforting meal, a warm stew that contrasted sharply with the sterile environment. It was the first time they had sat down to dinner in the apartment without the presence of the contract, the staff, or the public eye. The only light came from the massive windows overlooking the storm-lashed city and the few automated emergency lamps. Midway through the meal, while Seraphina was silently observing him, Elias's satellite phone, placed on the marble counter, suddenly rang. The display showed an unfamiliar number. He answered it with his usual controlled professionalism, but his face quickly turned ashen. The voice on the other end was frantic, possibly an old friend or a police contact related to the cold case of Daniel's accident. The content was muffled, but Seraphina caught a single frantic plea concerning new evidence and the word Daniel. Elias froze. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. His face, usually a mask of granite, crumbled into an expression of sheer debilitating terror. His breathing hitched, shallow and rapid, a visible physical manifestation of his deep-seated panic. He was utterly vulnerable, stripped bare by a simple phone call. Seraphina moved instantly. She did not ask questions. She acted on pure protective instinct. She crossed the short distance and reached for his hand, which was gripping the edge of the counter in a death-like hold. Her fingers closed firmly around his, grounding him. She held him until the raw panic subsided, her presence a silent, unwavering anchor against his terror. After he managed to end the call, Seraphina did not let go. Elias stood paralyzed, unable to retreat. In the dim light, his voice, when it finally came, was heavy with the weight of years. He began to speak not about business, but about the suffocating pressure of his inheritance, the isolation of his position, and the heavy burden of responsibility he had carried since the accident. He confessed that his coldness wasn't just a strategy. It was the only way to keep the overwhelming grief and self-hatred at bay. "If I let the warmth back in," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, "it will tear me apart." For Seraphina, it was the most genuine moment of connection yet. Once Elias had finally retreated to a troubled sleep, Seraphina, spurred by his confession and the raw fear she had witnessed, knew she had to understand the man he used to be. Remembering the old storage chest from Chapter 4, she meticulously searched the apartment's storage areas. Behind a secured panel, she found a locked compartment. Using a thin, improvised tool, she managed to spring the latch. Inside, she discovered a forgotten trove of his youth, not official documents, but a collection of high school journals and old, unlabeled photo albums. She opened an album to find a series of pictures of Elias as a teenager, not the sharp, distant tycoon, but a warm, messy-haired boy with an easy, radiant smile. There were sketches of buildings, architectural blueprints in his own hand, evidence of his abandoned dream. Seraphina realized she was looking at a ghost, the real Elias Thorne, a person of depth and affection that the current man had ruthlessly suppressed. Seraphina quietly closed the compartment. Her hand trembled not from cold, but from the magnitude of her discovery. The cold contract was dissolving. She was now deeply, dangerously invested in helping this frozen man find his way back to the person he was meant to be. The moment Seraphina and Elias returned from the tense solitude of the Seattle penthouse, the air in the Thorne mansion felt charged with unspoken truths. Seraphina wasted no time. She placed the perfectly restored mahogany music box. Its chip meticulously filled, its melody silent, but ready on Elias's imposing office desk. When he finally appeared, his face guarded, she blocked his path to the chair. She didn't shout or accuse. She spoke with quiet, unwavering certainty. "I know about Daniel, Elias. I know about the music box, and I know about the crack in the wall. I know about the architect you were supposed to be." Elias stood paralyzed, stripped bare by her knowledge. He stared at the music box, then at her, his steel-gray eyes showing fleeting panic before hardening into absolute coldness. He tried to reclaim control. "You have violated every term of the contract, Seraphina. You have snooped into my private life. You will leave this house immediately. I am not leaving until you look at me and tell me the truth." She countered, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "You are punishing yourself, Elias. The accident that took Daniel was not entirely your fault. You are freezing yourself, and it's killing the man you were meant to be." Her persistence broke through the final layer of his defense. With a sound that was half a growl and half a sob, a sound Seraphina had never heard him make, Elias collapsed onto the leather sofa. The carefully constructed facade shattered. He confessed the whole ugly truth in short, ragged bursts. He had been driving. He had been too fast, too reckless. The road had been slick. He lived, Daniel died. He detailed the immediate aftermath, the cover-up by the family lawyers, the feeling of absolute isolation, and the realization that the only way to atone was to become a ruthless machine, burying the loving brother and the creative dreamer forever. The coldness was his self-imposed penance. Seraphina had anticipated this level of self-blame. Driven by the lingering doubt from the satellite call Chapter 6, she had pursued the new evidence whispered on the line using the resources of her few remaining loyal contacts. She pulled a sealed envelope from her pocket. "Read this, Elias. It's a mechanic's testimony suppressed by the family legal team years ago. It states the brake lines in your car had been compromised days before the accident. You were reckless, yes, but you were not solely responsible for the vehicle failure." She had brought him a reprieve, a lifeline out of the crushing guilt. Elias took the document, his eyes scanning the technical details. He saw the legal truth that he was only partly culpable. The faintest flicker of relief appeared on his face, only to be extinguished immediately by an act of absolute self-sabotage. With a sudden, deliberate movement, he crumpled the papers and hurled them into the roaring fireplace. He watched them turn to ash, a grim determination setting his jaw. "It changes nothing, Seraphina," he stated, his voice now dangerously calm. "He died because I was behind the wheel. The guilt is mine. I deserve this punishment. You cannot save a man who refuses to be saved. Keep your kindness for someone else." He stood up, towering over her, using his height and his renewed coldness to push her away one final time. Seraphina stared at the burning evidence, watching her last hope for him turn into smoke. She realized the devastating truth. Her presence, her kindness, and her desire to heal him were not saving him. They were only amplifying the pain of his chosen self-martyrdom. The only way to truly love him now was to let him go. She could not remain a constant reminder of the warmth he feared. Her duty to the contract was done. Her duty to her heart demanded her departure. Silently, she retreated to the master suite. She swiftly gathered her few belongings, leaving behind the expensive wardrobe Elias had provided. She left the music box now pristine on his dresser. Next to it, she placed a folded document, a divorce petition signed and dated with the terms set to release him immediately from the obligations of the marriage. Seraphina walked out of the Thorne estate without looking back, merging anonymously into the busy New York traffic. Moments later, the silence she left behind was ripped apart by the insistent, frantic ringing of Elias's primary trading line. The crisis he had managed to suppress was now hitting the public domain. Cassandra Vance had launched a massive coordinated financial scandal leaking damaging fabricated evidence of market manipulation. News headlines screamed accusations. In minutes, Thorne Corp's stock began a terrifying plunge. Elias Thorne, sitting alone and holding the divorce petition, had lost both the woman he had finally begun to love and the empire he had built to mask his grief. The crisis hit Thorne Corp like a perfect storm, its financial foundations already weakened by years of Elias's emotional isolation and now under a targeted brutal attack by Cassandra Vance. Stock prices plummeted, media coverage was universally savage, and the merger, the linchpin of Elias's strategy, was in freefall. Elias sat alone in his office, not fighting the inevitable, but staring at the divorce petition Seraphina had left. He had convinced himself he deserved this complete and utter destruction. His empire, the shield he had built, was crumbling, and the one person who had breached its walls had willingly walked away. He was paralyzed, caught between the grief for Daniel and the sudden, crushing loss of Seraphina. Seraphina, meanwhile, watched the news coverage from her old, quiet apartment. The financial forecasts were dire, painting Elias as a ruthless fraud. She knew better than anyone that, while Elias was cold, he was not crooked. The earlier incident at the dinner, Chapter 3, had proven his underlying integrity. She realized Elias was too consumed by guilt to save himself. He would simply accept the collapse as his final penance. Her love, ignited by the vulnerable boy she had glimpsed beneath the ice, demanded she act. Ignoring the signed divorce papers and the safety of her family's debt resolution, she chose to return to the fire. She called a contact she had made during the brief period of their engagement, a respected financial journalist who owed her a favor, and requested a press conference for that afternoon. It was an unauthorized, chaotic arrangement held on the steps of the Thorne Corps headquarters. Elias, barricaded in his penthouse, watched the live feed in disbelief. Seraphina stood before the hungry mob of reporters, her emerald dress replaced by a simple, elegant dark suit, her face pale but determined. The reporters shouted accusations, but Seraphina silenced them with a single compelling gesture. She began to speak not about stocks and bonds, but about trust and character. She spoke of the man she knew, the man who valued honesty over $500 million, referencing the dinner incident, the quiet philanthropist who worked tirelessly for his city, the complex man of honor. She announced, completely against the advice of her contact and with profound personal risk, that she would be using the entirety of her private remaining family assets, the funds she had saved from their initial debt, to buy up as many of the rapidly depreciating Thorne Corps shares as possible. Her message was clear. She was putting everything she had, including her reputation, on the line for Elias. The press reacted with vicious skepticism, calling her delusional, a naive puppet, or a financially reckless fool. Yet her act of absolute public self-sacrifice was a devastating blow to Cassandra Vance's carefully orchestrated attack. Seraphina's emotional, tangible commitment resonated far more deeply than any calculated corporate spin could. It caused a profound pause in the market's panic, creating a moment of hesitation. This small, illogical wave of confidence was enough for the major loyal shareholders Elias had neglected to finally step in and start buying. The spiral was arrested, the merger was saved miraculously. Elias witnessed the entire broadcast. He watched her sacrifice the last remnants of her security for a man who had burned her emotional lifeline just hours before. The enormity of her action hit him with a physical force. She hadn't left him when he was rich. She came back when he was broken and used her last dollar to save him. He realized that the coldness he clung to was not only his prison, but his weapon against the only person who had ever truly loved him. He was supposed to be punished, but she was paying the price. leaving his office in disarray, driven by a primal need he couldn't name. Elias tracked Seraphina. She hadn't gone back to the mansion. He found her hours later, not triumphant, but utterly drained. She was sitting alone on a worn-out wooden bench in the small, quiet art gallery where she had hosted his sister Clara, Chapter 5. The gallery was dark, lit only by a solitary street lamp filtering through the window, highlighting the exhaustion etched onto her face. Elias stopped his imposing figure filling the doorway. He looked at her, his contract wife, his rescuer, the selfless woman he had tried to destroy. The sight of her raw, quiet suffering broke him completely. He didn't speak. He simply walked toward her slowly and dropped to his knees in front of the bench. He reached out and gently took her hands, which were cold and weak. He looked into her eyes, and in that moment, the years of armored silence, the layers of guilt, and the facade of the iceberg finally fractured. He tried to speak, to offer an apology or a defense, but no words came. Instead, a profound, gut-wrenching realization of love and loss washed over him. He lowered his head, pressing his forehead against their joined hands. A single hot, unstoppable drop escaped his steel-gray eye. It was Elias Thorne's first tear. It wasn't a tear of sadness for his empire, or for Daniel, but a tear of desperate love and agonizing regret for the woman he had nearly driven away forever. He wrapped his arms around her waist and clung to her, the desperate embrace, a silent, total surrender of his heart. When Elias woke up in the quiet stillness of the art gallery, still clinging desperately to Seraphina, the crushing weight of his emotional armor had finally lifted. He felt raw, exposed, and devastatingly weak, yet lighter than he had been in a decade. His coldness was gone, replaced by a clumsy, overwhelming tenderness. He held her close, tracing the curve of her jaw with a thumb that no longer shook with fever, but with the fear of loss. He didn't offer excuses. He offered a painful, halting apology. "I am so sorry, Seraphina, not just for the contract, but for the cruelty. I convinced myself I was protecting everyone by being the iceberg, but I was only destroying myself and nearly destroyed you. Thank you. You saved me." He acknowledged that she was the only one who had ever seen through the perfect facade and found the fractured man inside. The first few days of their new reality were spent in quiet solitude, addressing the man, not the mogul. Elias was a slow learner in the language of affection. He was observant, precise, and determined, but utterly inept at spontaneous emotion. Yet his commitment was absolute. His first public act upon returning to the financial battlefield was a powerful, non-negotiable defense of his wife. He scheduled a second official press conference not to address the market manipulation claims, but to firmly position Seraphina. He announced that her brave intervention had in fact saved Thorne Corp from a massive predatory scheme orchestrated by rivals. He publicly declared her his moral compass, making it clear that she was an integral trusted partner in his life and business. This public affirmation quickly stabilized the market's trust, and with the help of the loyal shareholders, Seraphina's sacrifice had rallied. The threat of bankruptcy was dissolved. Once the financial crisis was neutralized, Elias led Seraphina back to his vast office. The divorce petition, which he had snatched from the wastebin, was lying on his desk. He picked up the document, tearing it carefully into 4 distinct, satisfying pieces. "This contract is null and void, Seraphina," he stated, his voice deeper, richer than it had been before. "The old deal is finished." "I don't want a contract, wife." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a ring, not the enormous sterile diamond from their engagement, but a simple, elegant band cradling a deep sapphire, a blue stone that Seraphina had once mentioned, reminded her of hope in deep water. He took her hand, his fingers warm against hers. "I'm asking you to marry me again, Seraphina. For real this time. Not for public image, but because you are my life now. I don't know how to love you yet, not fully, but I swear I will learn. Will you teach me how to be the man you deserve?" Tears welled in Seraphina's eyes, but she was smiling, a genuine, unforced smile. She didn't hesitate. "Yes, Elias, I will teach you." They immediately drafted their new marital terms, the Thorne Rules version 2.0. They agreed that all the old rules were obsolete. The new rules were short, simple, and vital to their survival. Rule 1, never hide your pain. They would talk even when it hurt. Rule 2, Always sleep in the same bed for love not proximity. Elias also, without being asked, dedicated a massive light-filled wing of the mansion to Seraphina, transforming the cold space into a vibrant airy studio and private gallery, a permanent testament to her value in her art. Months passed. The Thorne estate transformed, filled with the warmth of Seraphina's laughter, the riot of her colors, and the simple tentative gestures of affection from Elias. Elias still worked tirelessly, but his priorities had shifted. One afternoon, Seraphina was in her new sunlit studio covered in paint, working on a large canvas, a vibrant abstract depiction of two figures embracing in a storm, a single blue sapphire glinting near the center. Elias walked in. He was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, his hair slightly rumpled, his demeanor relaxed. He watched her for a moment before silently walking up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back gently against his chest. He inhaled the mixed scents of turpentine and her jasmine perfume. He didn't speak of business or mergers. He simply rested his chin on her shoulder, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his back, and whispered the three words he had feared his entire adult life. "I love you, Seraphina Thorne." Seraphina slowly turned the small paintbrush in her hand, her expression radiating contentment. She looked directly at the viewer, her eyes twinkling. And that, my dear viewers, is how we went from a cold, cynical contract to a very real, very warm marriage. Elias has come a long way, but as you can see, he still needs a little help. He's mastering Rule 1 and Rule 2, but I think he needs one more guidepost, a third rule to push him from tycoon to perfect husband. So tell us, what do you think should be the third Thorne rule to help Elias Thorne, our recovering iceberg, truly master the art of romance? Drop your ideas in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for exclusive snippets and sweet updates on the Thorne family's new life. We can't wait to hear your suggestions.